Psychology is considered to be a scientific discipline because it uses the scientific method to gather its data, evaluate the data, and draw conclusions. So you may remember a hypothesis, which is a testable prediction. A lot of times people use that as a starting point to kind of evaluate their thoughts and set up a way to study and answer their question. A little bit about the history of psychology. Psychology began in the late 1800s in Germany in a lab where the first 40 years of psychology really focused on almost exclusively the study of mental life. So what this means are things that we cannot see, things that are going on in the mind. In 1920, there was a big shift in the discipline of psychology, and it became almost exclusively the study of observable behavior, what you could see someone doing. So that was a pretty big shift. For the first 40 years, mental processing; the second 40 years, what you could see almost exclusively. Now, I think most people recognize now, at least, that both of those are important. And in 1960, there was a reinterest in combining those two things and considering mental processes as well as observable behavior. So here we are today, present day, current day, modern day, contemporary psychology is considered to be the scientific study of both behavior and mental processes. Psychology, rather than looking at it as a field where you memorize a set of facts and names and dates. It's more of a way of evaluating ideas using the scientific method to determine whether someone's view or position on something or belief about what explains behavior and mental processes is actually valid. As we consider some different ways of looking at things in psychology, I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but I want you just to have an awareness of the different areas in psychology and ways of looking at a different, possibly different problem that you want to investigate. So another word for perspective is view. So you can look at something from a neuroscientific view, which is my area of expertise and training. So I often think about changes in neurochemistry and structural changes in the brain. We have evolutionary, behavior genetics, psychodynamic, which is all about Freudian principles, behavioral, observable behavior, cognitive, which means the way that you think about something can affect your behavior, which seems obvious, but it's really not. And then, of course, this last category, social cultural, how the culture that we live in, the society that we live in, might contribute to our behavior, and that's a big component right now, I think, in our current world. In psychology, there are many different subfields. So if you end up majoring in psychology and wanting to stay in the field, some people want to emphasize the research side. In order to do research in psychology, you need to have either a master's or a doctorate, PhD, or a PsyD. If you're doing basic research, you're trying to get at the underpinnings of a problem. Like, for example, in my lab, I did research on the rat brain, trying to find out the effects of drugs on the rat brain. And I wasn't trying to apply what we were learning about the rat brain to humans. Ultimately, that would be a long-term goal, but I was trying to just understand the basic neurotransmitters and neural pathways that were involved in drug abuse and drug addiction that then could be used in applied research. The other sort of main branch of psychology is counseling. If you don't want to go into research specifically or only, and you'd like to work with people that may need assistance, the counseling side of psychology is always in need of people to enter that field. You do need to have a minimum of a master's degree, and a lot of counselors help people with just everyday adjustment problems. So marriage and family therapists, school psychologists, people that have relationship problems or intimacy problems. This is a big there's a big demand for that. As you start working with people that have more significant mental issues, not just problems in everyday life, requiring a doctorate would be a clinical psychologist. So clinical psychologists do not have an MD. The field of psychiatry requires a medical degree, and at the present time, psychiatrists are the only area or only position that can prescribe medication. So clinical psychology is about treating people with psychological disorders. A lot of times it's outpatient, but sometimes it is in an inpatient psychiatric facility. One of the more recent subfields of psychology is what we call positive psychology. You might have a sense that a lot of psychology historically has been looking at problems in behavior and mental issues that people have that interfere with their ability to function. Well, positive psychology is the flip side of that coin, and it takes a look at resilience. People are resilient, how we bounce back from tragedy, bounce back from hardship, and looking at human behavior from that positive angle. I particularly like that slant. So one of the main questions in these modules 1 and 2, how do we quote unquote do psychology? So there are basically 3 main strategies. We can describe, we can predict, and we can explain. And those are getting to be moving from less powerful to more powerful in terms of really being able to draw some significant conclusions. So if you're just trying to describe behavior, you can just simply observe. Through the process of observation, it would be ideal if the person or animal that you were observing was in their natural environment. This makes you wonder about some of these reality TV shows, and the idea is it truly real when there's a camera on people all the time? Are they really acting in their so-called natural state when that happens? Another way that we could describe is doing something called a case study, where a single person is studied in great detail. And this is oftentimes very handy when you have something that is extremely rare. You might have a psychological disorder that isn't very common, or you might have a brain abnormality that is not very common. And so this is a very useful thing to get information about that particular condition. One of the things that you should be aware of as a risk of a case study is that you spend a lot of time studying this individual or small group of people, and it may get you a lot of information about them specifically, but it may not represent what is true of the broader population that may in fact be at risk of having that condition. So that's something to keep in mind. The last category of describe, or way we can describe behavior and mental processes, is by conducting a survey. I'm sure many of you have completed surveys during your life at some point. Obviously, this is less in depth than a case study, but it becomes very handy when you want to report on behavior, opinions, particularly if the survey is anonymous. People tend to feel like they can be much more honest about opinions if they're giving an opinion of a topic that's controversial. Anonymous surveys certainly might be able to be a way to get information about opinions like that. One other thing about this survey you should also be aware of is something called a random sample. We try to get a random sample of people to complete the survey, and this is very important. And the reason for this is that we want to represent the whole population. If you want to answer a question about an opinion and you only ask your friends to complete the survey, that's going to be a very limited population, and you might even be able to predict certainly the responses on that survey. It's important that we get a random sample of people across all walks of life, and to be able to get an opinion of the entire population. The second level is prediction, and this is where we use what are called correlations. Correlations essentially are asking a question, are two things related? Two variables. That's the word that we like to use in this area. So here's a good question that you might consider an example of a correlation. And this is a question. It's not really set as a hypothesis, but it's set as a question that we might be able to use and answer the question about how related are these two variables. So the question is, are depression and self-esteem related? I think most of us would say yes. Now here's a question. Does one of those predict the other? Do you think depression predicts self-esteem? Does your level of self-esteem predict depression? So does low self-esteem predict depression? Perhaps. Does depression predict low self-esteem? So these are some questions that you might want to consider when you are looking at a question. And what you might do is also remember that correlations allow us to look at how strongly things are related. They do not allow us or do not explain if one of the variables causes the other. So although correlations are useful, they are limited in that we cannot draw a cause and effect relationship. They are predictive, and they're useful in that manner, but they do not allow us to explain causal relationships. And that is where we get into explain, and we'll talk about that in a second. But here's an example of a correlation, and this is a real finding, a real report on in the media, wasn't too long ago, and scientists have linked TV watching with childhood obesity. In fact, the degree of obesity rises 2% with each hour of television viewed by those aged 12 to 17. Now, if you just take that on the surface and you don't understand correlations and predictions, you might immediately come to the conclusion that watching television causes obesity. Well, just sitting in front of the television doesn't cause you to become obese, but you know that there are definitely things that are related to watching TV that could contribute to obesity. For example, if you're watching TV, you're probably not outside being active. A lot of us, when we watch TV, what do? We eat while we watch TV. And during the commercial, we go get more food. And you might argue that this is not mindful eating, and so we're not really paying attention to quantities, and that could be a problem there. There are obviously some other explanations that you might be thinking of right now, but this was presented on CNN at one point as it was a causal relationship. And certainly now I hope you understand that this is just a prediction that definitely the hours of TV viewed, as they go up, the likelihood of obesity goes up. But you can imagine plenty of people who watch television who are not obese. So the final area of how we do psychology is to explain. And this is, again, the most powerful research method and the most powerful tool that we have to explain behavior and mental processes. And the way that we do this is through the process of experimentation, the classic psychology experiment that you may have heard of. This is the only research method that allows us to determine cause and effect relationships. So in an experiment, there are two main variables. Now, you think about the word variable, anything that varies, anything that can change. And in the experiment, we have two very important variables. We have the so-called independent variable, or IV, and this is what the experimenter is controlling, or the treatment that is being given to the subjects of an experiment. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is what is being measured, or, for example, the outcome. Another way to think about the dependent variable is that the independent variable affects the dependent variable. I know this is very confusing, so let me go over an example with you. So, for example, we would like to study the effects of alcohol on mathematical ability. Now, most of us can probably come up with a hypothesis that alcohol would negatively affect your ability to do math. I think that's a legitimate hypothesis, but we need to test that. So the independent variable, again, which is what is controlled by the experimenter or the treatment that's given, is the alcohol, the amount that's given by the experimenter. The dependent variable, as you can see in the example, a study on the effects of alcohol on mathematical ability, what you're measuring is math ability, which is basically the effect, if there is going to be any, of the alcohol. And we are, in our hypothesis, predicting that there is an effect. One thing when you do an experiment is we talk about conditions, experimental conditions. The experimental condition is the group that receives the treatment. They're the ones that are getting any dose of alcohol. But then we have to have a comparison group, and this is what we call the control condition. So this is the group that receives no treatment, no alcohol. Now in this example, everyone would have to consume a beverage that looked, tasted, and smelled just like alcohol, because we wouldn't want subjects to know which group they were in, but you would have to have a non-alcoholic beverage for the control group to consume, and then the only thing, hopefully, that's different between the two groups is the alcohol. You measure the mathematical ability, and the only difference between the two groups is the amount of alcohol that they are consuming. The control group is used as what we might call a normal comparison group. Some other issues that we should consider when doing an experiment is something that you may have heard of before, and it's called the placebo effect. The placebo effect is where you have seeming effects of a variable, of an independent variable, even though no treatment was given. So in this example of alcohol and mathematical ability, you might have a group of subjects that receive the non-alcoholic beverage, but they start acting intoxicated. That would be what we would refer to as the placebo effect. Placebo effect are caused by expectations of subjects, particularly in humans, where they believed they received a treatment and they act accordingly. And that would be an example there. You may also be familiar with something called a double-blind study or double-blind studies. Double-blind refers to the experimenter doesn't know which group of subjects received the real treatment. So in our example, alcohol versus no alcohol. All the cups look the same, all the drinks look and smell the same. But only half of them would have the real alcohol in them. So the experimenter doesn't know what the subjects are getting, and the subjects themselves don't know whether they've been placed in the experimental or the control condition. And this is important because you don't want the researcher to act or treat the groups differently or to bias the results in any way. Also, we need to randomly assign subjects to the conditions. So the group 1 might be the experimental group that is getting the alcohol needs to be randomly assigned to that group, and the control group subjects need to be randomly assigned into that group. So for example, if you were going to do this experiment, you'd have students come into a room, 21 and over of course, come into a room, and you would give them randomly a card that had a number 1 or a number 2, and the number 1 sat on one side and the number 2 sat on the other side of the room. And then the research assistant, because it's a double-blind study and the researcher doesn't know, the research assistant would be then administering the independent variable in cups to the subjects. The experimental group and the control group are where you are randomly assigned into those conditions. Here's an example of an experiment that we might do. Do people traveling on Highway 99 drive faster in the morning or the afternoon? Now, you might consider, well, let's see, what are we measuring? We're measuring speed. So that is the dependent variable. Well, what is the independent variable? Well, the independent variable would be the time of day, in the morning or the afternoon. So the independent variable, although that's not a treatment that we are assigning a group, we are observing, and we have selected the time that we are going to investigate. So 2 hours in the morning compared to 2 hours in the afternoon. And what we are measuring we would be measuring speed. I don't know if I have a hypothesis about this. I might think that people might drive faster in the morning because they want to stay at home as long as possible before going to work or school. Or you might argue, well, the afternoon, people want to get home. I'm not sure what the answer would be to this question. But let's do one more. Do students who study alone perform better on exams than those who study in groups? Well, the independent variable would be the type of study. So you would have half of your subjects assigned to study only alone, and then the other half of the subjects assigned to study only in a group setting with other students. And if you look at this question, do students who study alone perform better on exams than those who study in groups? This is the independent variable, but the dependent variable is essentially the exam score. Who does better? And that is what you're measuring, is the score and determining that. Again, this is an independent experiment. I don't know the result. I don't know what I would hypothesize this. I think it would be depending on the student with this one.